Pierre Rosanvallon, who I think, not just in my mind, but probably to all who know the subject matter, is the preeminent historian of democracy anywhere, really, today. And he has earned that distinction not just through his trilogy on the origins of representative government in France, but several other works. By now, I think altogether 20 or more books, of which over half are on this subject. Other subjects deal with issues which he dealt with earlier. He was an economist, if not in a very narrow professional sense, nevertheless interested in economic issues, was an expert for the CFDT union, and wrote on self-management and related topics. But democratic theory became the issue in his teaching at the École des Hautes Études and then later at the Collège de France. In that process, he has organized, along with François Furet, also the Fondation Saint-Simon, which was a think tank. And then subsequently, after Furet's death, when that organization did not continue, he organized yet another La République des Idées, which is, I think, also internet-based organization of communication among people interested in problems of democracy. I mentioned already, but I do want to say that he was Hans Speyer professor at the New School, and some students, older ones, probably none of them here anymore, had a chance to enjoy his lectures and presentations already then. So it is my great pleasure. He has written on populism before in the book Counter Democracy, which is in English. And I think its chapter on populism still remains extremely interesting. But now he has a book called, excuse me for my Hungaro-French, Le siècle du populisme, which he just informed me will be in German relatively soon. And there is a plan for an English translation too with Polity Press, forthcoming in September of 21. I hope you meant not 22. Okay, so Pierre, it's our great pleasure to welcome you, and you got a really fantastic audience here, and we look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Andrew, for your kind presentation. I'm very happy also to be part of your project, of your common seminar between Budapest and New York City. Populism, the word is everywhere, but the definition is nowhere. Because a lot of people think even that discussing populism is not a real subject, because it's an object so different. How can you imagine to use the same word for Chavez and Trump, to use the same word for Modi and for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, for extreme right partisan and left-wing people in Latin America? It's very clear that populism is a rubber word. But we shouldn't forget that a lot of very important words are rubber words too also. Consider the word democracy. Democracy is universally reclaimed as a central key of politics. But at the same time, there are so many definitions of democracy that you could say that the word itself is not a word that you could use easily. The same thing for liberty. I mean that the fact that some words are rubber words is part also of the question of politics today, because politics today is the heart of discussing the possibility to organize a social and political community, and it has always to be discussed. It has always to be redefined. So the fact to have a rubber word implies that you have to try to make it clear, but you can't say that you have to leave the discussion because it's too difficult to handle. In fact, I think you can consider populism from 3 points of view. you can consider populism, and it was the first uses of the word recently. I will return to the history of populism later. Was a fact of political, I could say, a political disruption at the end of the 20th century, mostly in Latin America, but also in Europe, of a new kind of political parties pretending to be beyond the difference between left and right. Political parties, in many cases, coming from extreme right in Europe. I will return to that. So the first aspect of populism is a name for a kind of electoral revolution, is a name for a political disruption. The second use of the term of populism is relied to an ideology. I think we could define populism, whatever may be the apparent huge differences between the leaders, between the political situation. We could define common elements of ideology between all those people, situation, and also countries. And the third element of populism is populism could be referred to as a special kind of political regime, as a kind of practice of government. I start so with the first element, populism as a political disruption. It was for a very long time, let's say in the 80s or early 90s in Europe, one very common phenomenon between France, even UK, Belgium, Netherlands, and some Nordic countries was the resurgence of extreme right parties. Le Front National in France, but also the Vlaams-Blok in the Flanders, and also the equivalent in Germany with now what is the AKP, and also in Italy. At that time, the word was not, populism was not in use. It was extreme right parties. And step by step, it was recognized that those parties had an origin in the extreme right wing of the political sphere, but they became something different. And that is a common problem of all the populist party today. You have to make a difference between their origin, I mean their history, and there are many different histories of political populist parties, and what they are in reality. For a very long time, the origin was the dominant factor. So in France, if you take the example of the National Front, it was in some ways a memory of Vichy, the memory of the old racist attitude of the late 19th century. It was an history of the Algerian War. So all that defined extreme right. But step by step, it started to be something different. And I think this difference between the origin and the present of a populist party is something very important to understand. Even in the contemporary case in the US, one Republican senator, John Hawley, is a senator of Missouri. He recently said our Republican Party, is now a class party. We are now a working class party. So you see in the American contemporary case, this kind of shift from classical republicanism, right-wing republicanism, towards something different. The fact that political leaders of the Republican Party could say, now we are a working class party, is something very, very new, and something that we have to consider very, very seriously. And it makes that this political disruption has been an electoral phenomenon almost everywhere, at least in Europe, during the end of the 20th century and early 21st century. But now we realize also that it is something that is appearing in a lot of other countries. And so populism is not only connected with a specific uh, political history, but is also part of a global history. It's part of a global disruption within, we could say, the democratic view of society and of politics. So that's the first element of populism. Populism is the expression of a political disruption. A lot of commentators say that, but they don't go further. When I think we could go further and define that, my second point, populism also as a political ideology. How to say that populism is a political ideology, knowing that between Bolsonaro and Chavez, you have not many things in common, and that the origin of the leaders, the origin of political experiences are really very, very different. But in fact, I think you can consider there are anyway some common points. And I would insist on the fact that you could define it, we could define 5 elements that populist movement have in common. The first element is their view of political legitimacy and their view of democratic expression. To them, legitimacy comes first from the election, the universal suffrage. They don't think that legitimacy could come from the law. In some way, they say that they refuse to consider that modern democracy is based on two elements. On one hand, the rule of law, and on the other hand, the universal suffrage. They consider that only the universal suffrage defines democracy. Because how could you consider as democratic, they say, an institution that is an institution that is not elected? And that is the reason why all the political populist movement have in common to refuse to consider as democratic political independent authorities, constitutional courts, and even judges. As you know, the expression to refuse a government of judges has been central for all for the populist movement. In some way, they defined a kind of what I could call a polarized democracy. Democracy has, to them, has not different elements in composition. Democracy is only one element, and this element is the election. Election is the root of legitimacy, and election is only the source of legitimacy for, at the same time, the institutions and the government. What makes, in some way, that they are very, in a very classical sense of the term, they are very strongly in favor of parliamentary democracy. The parliament is everywhere to them, and I will return to this definition to limit it later. But that's the first element. Legitimacy and democratic expression is only in the elections. The second element common to all the populist movement is concerned representation. They say that representation is not working very well in our days. And for a very simple reason, so that political parties are no longer really representatives of the people. And the solution to this lack of representative qualities, the solution is incarnation. You have to return to a politics of incarnation. And what is the name for politics of incarnation is a political leader. That is something that is very clearly stressed in the book of Ernesto Laclau, The Reason of Populism. And I insist on the fact that there are not many books coming from the populist side defining in theory populism. And the main book is a book of the left populist Laclau. He's almost the only one. Chantal Mouffe was only a follower, let's say. But Laclau is the only one to have produced an attempt, at least, of definition and of building a theory of populism. For the other, you have to pick a lot of sparse elements to define it. And in my recent book, The Century of Populism, I try to write in some way the theory of populism that the populists have not yet written. And so the second element in representation is incarnation. It means also that to them, democracy is a quality of relation between a population and the leader. It means that there is no room for the structure called political parties. Because what is a political party? A political party is an organization coming from below. A political party is recognizing that there are social differences, religious differences, territorial differences within society. And the very idea of party is to structure those social differences. And the history of political parties is an history of parties representing different social classes, representing different religions. Even in Europe, we had Catholic parties, we had Protestant parties, we had working class parties, we had peasant parties. And it means that the parties were organizing social diversity. But populists think that representation is not organizing social diversity in all the different dimensions of diversity, but that it is representing unity. And unity is based on the third element, the vision of society. The vision of society is a presupposition of homogeneity and unity, saying we are in modern society is a very complex society. And if you want to represent society, you can't represent all the differences. It would be too complicated. The classes no longer really exist. There are many differences in terms of what are your beliefs and so on. So representation, that the very notion of society could be only a notion based on a unity and homogeneity. That is sociological vision, I would say, and it's very clearly indicated in the book of Laclau, for an example. It means also that this definition through homogeneity make necessary to have a kind of antagonism organizing unity, because unity can't exist by itself. Unity always exists through a kind of adversary process. That's the reason why, in a very Schmittian way, I could say, they say that the very definition of homogeneity comes from the opposition to the elites, to oligarchies, and to every kind of dominant groups that could exist. The fourth element of the populist ideology is connected to their vision of economy and to this very specific relation between economics and politics. If you want to consider the people as a unity, as an homogeneity, you have also to consider a redefinition of the general will, a redefinition of sovereignty, because sovereignty could be difficult to define, and even the general will in divided society. But it should be very simple in a unified society. And how to produce this new development in the vision of sovereignty. It is in the field of economy also. How? Through protectionism. Remember that the slogan of Brexit was, we want to take back control. And how to take back control? It means that we lack control with the globalization, with the market economy. The political power is weaker because the economic powers are stronger. So you need to make economic powers weaker. And how to produce it? Through the limitation of the economic space. It means protectionism. That is a common point to all the protectionist movement to be in favor of protectionism, with some exception related to the specific situation. It's very clear today that if you are in Hungary, you can be a protectionist because the market of the European market is everything for you. If you are in Poland also, you can be, in terms of your vision of legitimacy, in terms of vision of representation, in vision also your vision of society. It could be the very basic point of view, populist point of view. But in terms of economy, you are obliged to be in open European economy because openness of economy means a lot of money for you. It's perhaps a little less power, but it's much more money. So those four elements, they are almost always present in most of the populist movement. That's really four common elements. In some cases, you could say that, for instance, color in Brazil, or it was the case also in Menem of Argentina, or even Bolsonaro today, they are in favor of free markets. But if you take the example of Collor, he was not, politically speaking, he was not a real populist. If you take the example of Menem in Argentina, he was not really a populist. We could discuss the case of Bolsonaro. So there is really the possibility to define a populist ideology. With, of course, it's an ideal type. And as in the case of every ideal type, you have a lot of specific differences coming from the peculiarities of the people, of the local situation, and so on. But more or less, it's very clear that in most of the cases, this ideal type give you a possibility to analyze and to understand populism, even in the case of Trumpism. The third element, the third point of view for approaching the question of populism is concerning practices of government, that is, populist regime. The first row I discussed populist electoral organization, in the second populist ideology movements, and now I come to populist governments, regimes. Most of them, there are three common points. The first is that they give a huge room to the expression and to the maneuver, I could say, of political emotions. They understood that societies were not only governed by interest, but also by values, by emotions. And this importance given to emotions is something central to populism. Now, I would say it's something at the same time central, but also it's perhaps the stronger point of the populist vision of politics. They understood that emotions were very important today. And you can see the difference. For instance, in France, Macron only understands what is rational. And it's the reason why he couldn't understand the yellow jackets, for instance, because the yellow jacket, it was about emotions. It was about their feelings and not only about their interest. And I would say that classical parties, they mainly deal with interest. When populist party, they give a lot of room to emotion, and that one of their strong points. The second common point of the populist regime is, I would say, a tendency to desinstitutionalization. I mean, they want to simplify democracy. They want to simplify democracy being simplified by the concentration on the electoral sphere, democracy being simplified with the relation between the leader and society. And it's the reason why all the intermediary bodies are considered as a problem. And they are considered also as illegitimate. That is the case, really a common case in all the populist regime with the constitutional courts. They try to limit the power of constitutional courts. And in many cases, they succeeded in transforming the in transforming the constitutional courts in elements of their government and not as independent bodies. That's the same thing for independent authorities. Most of the populist government have destroyed those kind of independent authorities. And it is also in this direction that you have to understand their attitude towards the freedom of the press. Napoleon III, in the mid-19th century in France, was in some regards a kind of ancestor of populism, because he was the first to say that representation was not through political parties, but representation meant a direct relation with the country. And he had an expression. He said, "I am a man people, un homme peuple, a man people, un hombre pueblo." And I was very surprised to see that the term in Spanish, hombre pueblo, was used by Gaitan. Gaitan, you know, it's a Colombian leader that was a founding father, I could say, of Latin American populism. Gaitan was very, very often quoted by Chavez, and that is also very often, that he was also very often quoted by Castro. And his definition of man people, homme peuple, hombre pueblo, yo no soy un hombre, yo soy un pueblo. It is the very expression of Gaitan that was very often used also by Chavez. That it applies really to those political leaders. And it means that concerning the freedom of the press, they consider that freedom of the press is something that should be discussed. Napoleon III, I return to Napoleon III, had this expression. He said to journalists, yes, it's very clear. I want to limit your powers. I want to limit the freedom of the press. But why? because you journalists, you have not been elected. So you journalists, you pretend to play a role on the public sphere. You pretend to be a kind of public power. You pretend to be a representative power to express something, and you have not been elected. When me, I have been elected by millions of people. And I was very struck by the fact that Orban very often had expression of the same time. And of course, he can't say it as frankly as Napoleon III was saying. But when you consider the attitude of Faux's populist regime towards the press, the result is the same. For instance, if you take the example of Gazeta Wyborcza, I have very often, even recently, discussed with Adam Michnik, but the newspaper that was the main newspaper in Poland, they can no longer receive any kind of advertisement from public companies and even from private companies, because the government puts the pressure on the private company to avoid the development of Faux's newspaper. And they said that the printing presses are too noisy, that there are many arguments to limit de facto the liberty of the press. And I call all those elements of desinstitutionalization of democracy. I think to them, democracy is not only direct, democracy should be immediate. And I think this notion of immediate democracy is stronger than the classical notion of direct democracy, because direct means direct expression of the people. Direct democracy means referendum and not only election of representative. When the vision of immediacy means that democracy is based on the fact that you have not intermediary powers. That's the difference between direct and immediate democracy. And the last common element of the populist regime is also that they consider that their legitimacy is not only an arithmetic legitimacy, because in most of the cases when you have free election today, nobody gets 99% of the votes. In all the countries, opinions remain divided. But when a populist party comes to power, even if he gets 51%, he said, perhaps in arithmetic term, I got 51% of the vote. But in fact, those 51 are the real people. And so in moral term, I represent much more than 51%. In real term, I represent the whole people, because the whole people is not only an arithmetic definition, the whole people is a moral definition. And the real people, the totality of the people could be included in some way in the 51%. And that is the reason why the populist regime, they think they are permitted to be elected for an indefinite period. A common point to all the populist regime is to have tried to develop process of irreversibility, to manipulate the constitution in order to be maintained into power much longer than it was organized along the constitution. And the last example is, of course, Putin in Russia. Alors, within the case of European Union, it would be much more difficult to adopt the vision of Putin. But in Latin America, it has been the case in Bolivia, it has been the case in Ecuador, it has been the case also in Venezuela. That is an element, a common element. And in some way, you could say that when Trump spoke of stolen elections, he meant that he said normally, he said it was in 2 years ago. He said normally we should be reelected. Why normally? Because we are representing the real people. And so morally speaking, we should be reelected. And if we are not, it will be because the election would have been stolen. And so in the expression, the election has been stolen, he meant that election is not a matter of arithmetic. A real election is about the expression of the real people. And he was the real people. So he was permitted to say that arithmetic is less important than morality and the fact to represent, morally speaking, represent the people. So if we consider populism as a political ideology, populism as a certain kind of practice of government, there are clearly many common points. And of course, there are also differences. When those two elements have been crafted, the question is to say how to fight against populism, how to criticize populism. For a very long time, and even now, a lot of people say that populism has to be defeated because populism is illiberal. And yes, in practical terms, populism is in fact illiberal. It is illiberal because it is reducing certain kind of political liberties. It is illiberal because it is limiting the very definition of what the rule of law means. So it is, in fact, de facto illiberal. But the populist leader would tell you, yes, it is illiberal, but we want it to be illiberal because real democracy is not liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a kind of limited democracy. And our vision of democracy is real democracy. So yes, you are true. We are not liberal Democrats because liberalism is a diminution of the meaning of democracy. It means this argument is a very weak argument to say that populism is illiberal. You have to return to their vision of politics to criticize populism from the point of view of democracy. Freedom of the press is not only a liberal item. Freedom of the press is a democratic necessity. It's not only an individual liberty. Freedom of the press creates something in democracy. It creates a possibility of deliberation. It creates the possibility to make everybody part of a process. And in this direction, you could also say that independent authorities, they are not liberal authorities, they are democratic authorities. Why? Because democracy is the regime of the general will. But the general will is not the 51% majority. The rule of majority is necessary, but the rule of majority is not enough to define what is general in the will of the society. And you can only consider it if you say that the reality is moral majority and not arithmetic majority. Because if you say that moral majority is a real majority, so arithmetic majority is nothing in some way. And so you could think that elections are no longer necessary in some regards. But if an independent authority is democratic, is because independent authority is a kind of authority a kind of institution that nobody could be the master. It belongs to nobody. And democracy is not only the power of everybody, but everybody is also, in some cases, the name for nobody. The power of nobody is also an element of the definition of the general will. And in the same direction, you could say that democracy is also the power of anybody. Anybody means that every individual citizen has a special room, is recognized as a singular person with specific entitlements, specific rights. And that is the Constitution who entitles every citizen to a specific right. So you could say that a constitutional court is a power, give a practical meaning to the power of anybody. In France, we have now, since very few years, we have a specific process called the question of constitutionality. It means that individual citizens could say that they consider a law is not in line with some element of the Constitution. And even where you have not this kind of specific possibility of individual interventions through, of course, complicated process, there are elements having the same result, saying that the court is a democratic power because it's a power of anybody, because constitution is somewhere is a memory of the general will. And the memory of general will is the power of anybody. So it's on the field of a definition of democracy, on the field also of discussing, for instance, the referendum. Why the referendum is not the last word of democratic expression. This element, for instance, is something very important in the discussion of populism. Same thing concerning the definition of the people. Democracy is about not only organizing the people, but it is about making real the idea of the people, building a political community. It's making real theoretical definition of the people. And for all those reasons, I'm very struck by the fact that today many arguments against populism can be effective for a discussion with populists. They don't consider it's room for discussion. But if you want to criticize populists, you have to discuss step by step their very definition of democracy, along the 4 lines I mentioned concerning their vision of representation, their vision of sovereignty, their vision of the general will. All those elements have to be discussed from the point of view of democracy, and not only from the point of view of liberalism. If you take the example of representation, populists say, well, we have given a stronger definition of representation. And of course, it could be discussed, but their vision of incarnation could be considered as strong compared to the poor and very weak definition of representation in our political parties today. But they forget one very important point, that representation is not only giving to somebody the possibility to speak for you, but representation means also making present your personal problems within the political sphere. Representation is making present and not only presenting for somebody. That is a point that is very rarely discussed concerning populists. And I remember a discussion I had in Venezuela with ministers of Chavez. And when the discussion started on those specific points, why referendum is not only the last name for democracy, why representation should be understood differently, why there are several definitions of the general will, and why you are not entitled to consider that arithmetic is weaker than a moral definition of the people. In all those cases, I was struck by the fact that all the people around Chavez, they said, yes, I understand what you said, but the point is that we are under attack. We are under attack of the Americans. We are under attack of the oligarchies. We are under attack of intellectual elites and so on. So they justified their vision not because it was a strong vision, but because it was a defensive vision. That is a point that is very, very important to mention. As a conclusion, I would say that populism will be part of our political life for a very long period. Even when the government are defeated, populism remain. In the US, Trump is out, but Trumpism is present and will remain present. And even in the US, the more surprising fact is that Republican Party, it could be considered as a very weak party now, but the populist part of the Republican Party is very strong and will remain very strong. In France, for instance, the last poll showed that Marine Le Pen could get as much as 48% of the votes in the next presidential election. When poll said that you can get 48%, it means that it could be possible you to win. And that's the reason why I consider that populism is not only one present moment, but populism will be present, will be a problem for a very long period from now. And the only possibility to reduce populism is to renew democracy, understanding that democracy had always two definitions. Democracy is a political regime. It means a set of procedures, a set of legal instruments. But democracy is also a kind of society. Democracy is also a society trying to define what equality could be and could mean. And populism has a strong vision of equality as homogeneity. Populism has a strong vision of the future of democracy. You can, of course, discuss it, but it is a strong vision. Homogeneity as an element defining equality. It has been defined in this direction by a lot of political philosophers in the mid-20th century. So they are very strong definition. And the strength of populism is also, in my view, due to the weakness of our thought of democracy. And that's the reason why one of the responsibilities of intellectuals today is to make stronger the definition of democracy. And making stronger definition of democracy is not only making more frequent election in the sense of a traditional participatory democracy, let's say, But anyway, it's a stronger democracy that could be the key to a reduction of the influence of populism. Because, that will be my last word, we are entering decades of exception. I think that for many reasons, for reason of the climate, for reason of the pandemic, for a lot of reasons, the exception will be our daily life in many years and decades to come. So, if we don't define a stronger democracy, this context of the emergency, this context of permanent emergency, will make easier the victory of populist parties. So there is a challenge. And one part of the challenge, of course, it's a global political and civic challenge. And for one part also, it's an intellectual challenge. And this intellectual challenge, it's our responsibility to us. Thank you. So we start the discussion now?
Yes, for this wonderful presentation. It's kind of amazing how much we agree on the fundamentals, but we do disagree on some issues. I will raise them. I agree with both parts of the presentation, the definition and the politics, but there is a moment where I noticed a contradiction. And that moment is that on definitional level, you start out with the electoral aspect, which of course undeniably is empirically part of the phenomenon. You start out with the electoral aspect. And then when you come to the government level, you then actually depict, which is empirically also correct, attacks on free elections. Finally, the concept of a stolen election represents a complete attack on the electoral principle. So, two questions. How are these two things reconciled in practice? And then secondly, on a definitional level, if this dimension is so different in the case of a populist government and in the case of a populist opposition, should they both be called populist at all? Okay.
There should be the name populist has been given to those kind of movement and government because finally they accepted at the beginning the word populism was an insult in many countries, but this insult was reconsidered as a positive point that the movement of stigmatization, classical movement, the reversing of stigmatization that gives power, possibility to transform an insult into something that you could be, of which you could be proud. And today, populism is the name that for the government accept as a definition of them. So it's not only a label, it's also a self-definition, populism. And it's the reason why it's easier now to clearly to speak of populism. For a very long time, it was unclear. I just reminded at the beginning that in Europe, for instance, we spoke only of extreme right-wing political parties, and even now, some people continue to speak of extreme right. Of course, there are elements of extreme right, and there are differences. If there is one key difference between a populist party, is the difference between left and right-wing populist parties, very clear. Because a right-wing classical populist parties, they put the emphasis on fight against immigrants, even with racist elements and so on. That's very clear that right-wing populism makes a difference on those 2 points of racism and immigrants. When left-wing populism put the emphasis in many cases on redistribution. That's very clear. And that's what makes a difference with some populism in Latin America, for instance. To them, the definition was not about racism, but was even in the case of Maduro and perhaps also Korea, an answer to racism. That is something very, very different. But the fact that they accepted, some movement and some regime accept the definition of populism, or accept, according to the Russian language, they speak of sovereign democracy. But sovereign democracy is defined by all the elements I mentioned. If you take the notion of sovereign democracy in Russia, they accept the definition of legitimacy, of institution, of representation. All those elements I mentioned, they accept. So, yes, there is a difference between a movement and a regime. But in some way, a regime is a truth of a movement, because an ideology could have a kind of flexibility, but there is a reality of practices. There is a reality of political decision. And when you consider political regime, you see very clearly what an ideology is in practice. It's ideology in practice. You see?
First, I'd like to join Anna for thanking you for this very inspiring and clear presentation. I just, in every point, just I could identify how the Orban government is populist. And they use actually this term that you're not legitimate because you're not elected, not for the press, but mainly for civil society organizations. This is a very frequent criticism of human rights NGOs, actually. But my question is connected to the point Andrew raised. You used the term ideology with these points. But my question is that how much this is, or these points are ideological elements of populists, or how much they are strategic necessities coming from the empirically also proven fact that they do not like to hand or resign from power when it comes to that. So, and maybe this is also reflecting on the point that you mentioned, that they are very diverse by origin. So maybe this is not their ideological route, but it develops as they apply certain strategies to grab and maintain power.
Yes, you consider that the term ideology is too noble, is too strong. Yes, it was a point of view, for instance, of Laclos. Laclos, the title of Laclos' book was Populist Reason. It means populist arguments. So, yes, I could have said populist arguments, because what you can clearly see are arguments. But those arguments, they constitute something that makes sense, that makes globally sense. And if you don't want to use the term ideology, that clearly the term ideology has a complicated history. So you could say, well, ideology, it means also in the Marxist sense of the term, false vision and so on. So you could, perhaps it would be easier to speak of political culture. I don't know, perhaps other terms, but whatever may be, when I use the term ideology, it was used in a very weak definition of ideology. I could have said political culture. and I could have said also arguments. But arguments, when you use a certain set of arguments, it makes, globally speaking, at the end, it makes something that define a political culture, that defines something global. And I won't insist on this term of ideology. Is even not used in my book, but I think in different languages he has a common acceptance, making it easy to address.
I was going to call on first Antal Erkane, who is a co-organizer, and then Adam Brown. So let Professor Erkane go first, and then I'll call on Adam next.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really very inspiring. So I think try to make a framework. If when we are using this term, that what aspect of this term can be analyzed and I have two comments. One, that you started with three aspects of populism: the disruption of politics, ideology, and regime. Especially the two, the second and the third, ideology and the regime. I think it looks like independent factors, but these are they are crossing each other, and they have very different, and there are very different combinations. If we empirically just want to analyze a case, what mechanism is behind that we can identify as a populist system. And you mentioned the Orban regime, so I think that that's a very good example. From an academic point of view, to live there is not so much good, but because in the EU, I think this is the only regime which is a regime, meaning that the power is in the hand of an extreme right or populist government. And as I see that, as I feel that if we want to understand the Orban regime, the power aspect is more important than the ideology aspect. It's a question actually that the ideology causes the creation of the populist regime, or the populist regime arrives to a stage when realize that they must give something to the people. And what you mentioned, that say, for example, the homogeneity of the society. I think that this homogeneity is a virtual homogeneity which became an important goal in the mind of Orban, and he created a virtual homogeneity, and this is actually the nation, the nationalism. And then he said that there are members of this nation, and the others who do not agree with him, they are out of this nation. They are not, they are betraying the nation. So, and then people, of course, emotionally, and that's right, emotionally, it's very important that people should connect to this kind of political construction in an emotional way. But to me, it seems that it's not cognitive, but it's really effective. So much more. So there is no rational control, because if you have a cognitive attitude toward the question, you can have a rational control. But in the Hungarian majority of the people, actually, this majority is not a real majority, because it's a constructed majority. Because from the 8 million eligible voters, there are only maximum 3 million who vote for the Orban regime, and it was created, the power management, that this 3 million people represented in parliament 2/3 majority. So it's a trick. It's a very simple power trick. So this is, I'm really curious about your opinion. And the second is just a comment what you told, that how we can fight against populism. Let's say, if I simplify, according to my feeling, the only way how we can fight against it is political socialization. which starts at the school, even in the kindergarten, the schools, and going on everywhere. You have to politically socialize the people to understand the differences, what you extremely well discussed in your lecture. So, of course, not in this level, but in a very simple way to teach people, if they want to choose, because of course that's right to choose, why should they choose a democracy instead of a populist regime? Thank you so much.
I would just add that I think you are very right concerning the necessity to develop those points in terms of socialization, and even with very young people, not forgetting at the same time that one of the strengths of populism is that they speak in terms of emotions and not only in terms of reason. And today, there is also a class difference. The people speaking in terms of rationality and the people speaking and feeling with emotion. And that is a central question for democracy, because I mean democracy has also to make a room for feeling. Democracy has to be concerned with disrespect, with humiliation, with lack of reconnaissance and so on. So it's very important also to include in the political democratic language all those elements, because if you take the electors on Trump, but perhaps also of Orban, they think that they are not enough considered, that they are humiliated in some way. And I think you also have to respond on this level. The first point you mentioned, that for the government, that you take also the example, of course, of Orban, they have become powers. And now they are powers in themselves and for themselves. And at a moment, populist regime, they are only they become only autocratic regime for themselves. That's very clear. And that's also a point of discussion of populist regime, that is considering the moment where populist regime, it means elected populist regime, they turn to kind of autocracy, what we call democrature. It means demotorship. I don't know what is how you can put it in English, but democracy and dictatorship, demotorship, for instance, and also as a kleptocracy also, because in all those regimes, you have a tendency to see the development of a new class, and you turn from populism to a new class with the language of populism, but with the practice of special interest. That's very clear. That's very clear in Hungary, for instance, and that's very clear also in Russia, and it was very striking also in Venezuela. So yes, you mentioned important point. Thank you.
Okay, so Adam Brown was next, and then Professor Cohen after that, and Cesar Castillo after that. Please, Adam.
Thank you, first of all, for this great presentation. I was very curious about your notes on political emotions, specifically about what kinds of political emotions you're referring to, and if we can productively separate those. So my mind immediately went to emotions from the leader and emotions from the people, and I was unsure if one of those was more important than the other, if the relationship between the emotions of the leader and the people are important, or how that interaction works. I was also curious about different particular kinds of emotions. You've referenced love and hate. If either one of those or if other particular kinds of emotions are important, and if a specifically male and chauvinistic kind of emotion that we've seen among a lot of populist leaders are important. I essentially am just curious about this point and wanted to hear your thoughts on it more.
I mainly refer to people's emotions in terms of injustice, in terms of lack of consideration, in terms of humiliation. Consider one very interesting point is that for the voters of Trump, a lot of them were working class people. But their concern was not about billionaires. Their concern was not about inequalities. If you consider the literature in social sciences for the the 10 last years, the literature on inequalities has been huge. Let's take in the US, of course, Piketty, Milanovic, or The Triumph of Injustice was recently a bestseller. But for the rank and file, the question of the billionaires, the question of huge inequalities is not their problem. Their problem is the personal injustice that they are referring to, and the personal insult they are considering. And that is one thing that has been understood by populist parties. Their arguments, their language is based on the feelings of the people and not on the theories of societies. And if you consider, in Europe, if you consider as well classical liberals and socialists, they consider society because they have a good knowledge of social sciences, what is the middle income of people, what is the situation of the welfare state, and they think in global terms. But it's not in those terms that the people approach reality. And the yellow jacket in France, it was exactly the case. They didn't say that the government had the wrong vision. They said, first, the government doesn't understand our personal situation. And it is even the reason why they refused to have leaders. They refused to have representatives because they said, my problem, my situation, my location. And it was always in terms of what is my personal life, practical life. And that is something that has been understood by populist movement in some way. And this dimension has to be reintroduced into democracy, I think.
Okay, Jean Cohen, and then Cesar Castillo.
Hi. Well, of course, you know that I agree with much of what you said, too. And you also know, in particular, with respect to the last argument, that I wrote something on the politics of resentment. And of course, that meshes with what you're saying. But nevertheless, I mean, there are lots of points of agreement and lots of points of where we might formulate things differently. You and then Andrew and I have a book coming out on populism, as you know. But the thing is that, I mean, what I didn't really yet hear from you is an analysis about why and why now in so many places. And so, yes, you described the way people feel, les vestes jaunes, the yellow vests in France. I mean, the people in the United States, what are they called? The ones in the Midwest, et cetera, and in other places too. But the question is, why do they feel so disrespected? Certainly, they're not the first. I mean, if you think about, as a thought experiment, think about African Americans in the United States. I think we could safely say that group feels disrespected. They certainly have been economically badly off and are even worse off now. They don't seem to be they don't feel that their voice is heard, et cetera, but they're not populist. They're even religious. They're even Black evangelical. They don't even play that card. So the interesting question is why? What is it? There has to be something more specific going on that accounts for the attractiveness of this kind of rhetoric, that situates itself within the democratic imaginary, that claims to be speaking for the popular sovereign, et cetera, that plays on this rage. But why is there this rage among these particular groups? And I would think the answer would have to come on two levels. One is in terms of actually long-term structural transformations, and then the other would be conjunctural in terms of each society. But it's quite striking that that this is happening everywhere, in many cases with similar groups, rural, declining industries, et cetera. But what it is that is specific, what it is that accounts for this in the last, I'd say, 30, 40 years, I think would be on the political level, on the social level, on the economic level, would be worth specifying a little bit.
I understand your question. I could say two things. So first, why now?
Right.
Why now in global, as a global response? I would say now because our democracy is tired. Our democracy has been weakened. We are the cycle of we are at the end of a certain type of cycle of democracy. So there is a democratic moment concerning the question of specific group. You mentioned the feeling of disrespect, for instance. But before, a lot of blue collars, they didn't have this feeling of disrespect.
No.
Why?
Right.
Why? Because they were part of strong union, of strong. If I refer to the European experience, when you were a member of the Communist Party, you could be proud to be a member of Communist Party because this party was strong. He was connected with strong countries. He was connected with the image, and they were. When you were a member of the Communist Party, you were Picasso was also a member of the party. So you said, well, Picasso is member of my vicinity. You could say that Rosanvallon, Nobel Prizes, they were a member of the Communist Party. So you could be proud. You were in some way you had a very simple job, but at the same time, you could have a feeling of proudness. And this feeling of proudness has dissolved itself because all those social structures, of political structures, you were involved too, they disaggregated. And that's the reason why. They were disaggregated.
Could I follow up a second?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, in effect, what you're saying, I think this has to be mentioned because otherwise, if we just talk about inequality and, oligarchy and all that stuff, we miss the idea that actually the people who actually are part of, especially right-wing populism, it's a little different in Latin America when you're including new groups into a left project. Venezuela, Morales is slightly different, although it has the authoritarian logic. Nevertheless, it's different. But so the groups that are now populist, in effect, I think you could argue that the basis of social self-respect and social honor that they had in a previous form of society, let's call it industrial, up till it really became post-industrial, those are eviscerated. And so there's a sense of loss of status, loss of this, and impossible, and a sense that no one is paying attention to this, and the loss of the basis of social honor. I think that's true. I think it would also relate to the idea of loss of voice, because precisely the unions and the parties that did speak for them and did speak to them no longer do. I suspect there would have to be a critique of what the ways in which socialism, and not in America, so we never had it, but socialism and social democracy, but also the Democratic Party developed and lost contact and no longer played that representative role. And then one would have to get into analysis of the party systems themselves as to why they became disconnected from civil society. And then finally, of course, there is no question about the economic transformation in the sense that we now have a really, for the first time, global economy. I mean, China's in the world economy, so is India. And so it's a question, a serious question, with the old social democratic bargains, which were basically European and based on a lot of new imperialist extraction, whether these could actually deliver the goods. So, so yes, I think that's important to sort of bring in those dimensions. And then, of course, each state, each place would be very specific. France would be different from, I don't know, Germany with the Eastern German, grabbing it, and United States, etc. But there are these generalities. So yes, thank you.
We have 19 more minutes, so we have to be now careful. But Cesar, please.
Thank you for the presentation. I will be quick. I have a question regarding the ideological characterization of the populism, and specifically with the vision of the economy, because you mentioned that most of these populist movements or discourses are more concerned with closed economies. But I want to bring the experience of my country, for instance. The populism during the time of Fujimori was more concerned with a society of entrepreneurs. He take the idea of the informal entrepreneur to modify the vision, the general vision of citizenship. So he gained this kind of leverage in discursive terms, and it was a very, very bad dependence issue, because now, when the new Fujimorist party, and also when Hernando de Soto, who is now taking part of the elections of this year, they all the time bring both the populist discourse from a right-wing point of view and market ideas, free market ideas. So how could you explain this particular case, or how would you interpret this particularity?
I don't know Peru well enough to answer precisely, but I think that something equivalent could have been said about the Argentina at the time of Menem, or the Brazil at the time of Collor. I would say perhaps Fujimori, Collor, and Menem, they were at the edge of populism. They were not as clearly populist leader as Chavez was, for instance, or as Perón, of course, was. They had some elements of populist attitudes and language, but they were, regarding the ideal type I mentioned, they were more or less at the border. And perhaps also that in their situation, protectionism had no meaning, because you hadn't. The global industry was relatively weak in Peru, when the informal sector was very important. If you say in Britain, we must take back control with the Brexit, it has a very clear economic meaning. But in a country where the informal economy means perhaps 30 or even more % of the GNP, of course, you don't can use the same terms for making stronger your sovereignty. That was different.
If I could also say something about this Peru issue, very briefly, extremely briefly. One has to distinguish, even in Fujimori's case, between his election as president and then his self-coup, and then what they do after the self-coup. Political scientists refer to his pattern as bait and switch. In other words, it was more a classical campaign in terms of historical populism in Peru, although, of course, in opposition to APRA. But then in power, indeed, there is this neoliberal turn. And I think that could be explained by the population segment to which he is, you know this much better, of course, the precariat, which is enormous in Peru. And it is not helped by state interventionism, because it's not even legal in terms of its economic activity. So the entrepreneurship represented a response, in a way, a synthesis between his appeal to an underclass initially, and then appeal to the precariat, which is almost the same once after the autogolpe. So I would say that I would, a little bit differently than Pierre, I would include these neoliberal populisms, Uribe, Menem, but especially Fujimori, under the populism category. But Fujimori more than anybody else, certainly. There's no, with Menem, there is an argument, much better argument, and Uribe didn't even succeed in getting himself his term limits removed. But Fujimori is populist, clearly, but it's a bait and switch populism. Okay, Javier probably knows a lot about this too. So Javier Moisen, please.
Yeah, it's actually also about protectionism and the economy, because like here in my country, in Mexico, we are kind of going back to, or at least the president is trying to go back to making the state be the biggest employer. So like everyone is working for the state. That is like a really 1970s approach. So I was just wondering if we can say that populism is like inherently against economic integration because of the protectionism that you mentioned, but also because of the real people part. So more than like a host, like a thin ideology that needs a host ideology to adhere itself to, I was just wondering if you think that it's an inherent characteristic that it is against economic integration, whether it is a left-wing populism or a right-wing populism. In the left wing, because of the protectionism part, and in the right wing, because of the real people, the genuine people characteristic. So yeah, I just think that it's very interesting that in Peru, it was a very neoliberal populism, but here in Mexico right now, we're going back to the 1970s, state being like the biggest employer out of everyone. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, and thank you for the presentation, which was very, very, very cool.
Certainly that when you consider the different elements composing the ideal type, the element concerning the economic vision is probably the element where there are more differences. I think the vision of society, the vision of democracy, the vision of representation are the stronger point, common point. And for a reason I am not only really capable to discuss, because it should be necessary to know precisely the economic situation in every case. That is on this point that there are the more differences. But I'm not capable to say if those differences in terms of economic policies and economic structure, they come from the context that are very different, or if they come also from element of theory, element of doctrinal element that I don't know. Concerning the European case, I know much more precisely. It's very clear that for Orban can't be a protectionist because all the subsidies of Europe come from the acceptance of an open economy. So he can't. In Latin America, the situation is certainly much more different in every case.
Yeah, previous history has something to do with it, because where the import substitution models collapsed, the old-fashioned economic populism was unviable. That's an important factor. The communist countries of Central Europe have a somewhat parallel issue, but it was actually the social democrats, the socialists, who fell victims of it by becoming neoliberal. They became the neoliberal.
Yes.
Anyway, I'm very happy to see Elżbieta Matynia, who's raising her hand. The next question is yours, Elżbieta.
It's a little bit of a reaction. I came late, so I'm terribly sorry. I just was on another thing, but I wanted to. Something was extremely important, and it's difficult to deal with theoretically in the presentation of Professor Rosanvallon, and it is a question of emotions and the moral disquietude. And so I wanted to go back to what Jean said, what went wrong and why now. I don't know why now, but I think that something went wrong, and I think that something was taken away from the world we lived in, and I'm using it abstractly rather than historically. And I think solidarity, which was so carefully nurtured, solidarity as the sense that this is an obligation of carrying some other person's burden on our backs, that is gone. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of here with Arendt. I'm not thinking about solidarity as emotion. Arendt said solidarity is based on reason, and Pity is based on emotion, but I think this is gone, and without solidarity we cannot have, I think, democracy. And we have freedom. A Polish historian, I will be very quick. A brilliant Polish historian, Karol Modzelewski, kind of gave us a vivid pointer here. And I'm a little shy talking about it in front of the Frenchman. Looking back at French Revolution, he said, what's left today of the appealing grand trinity, liberté, égalité, and fraternité, is liberté. There is absolutely no doubt that in the process of transformation, that's my interpretation then, to liberal democracy, égalité and fraternité, the key principles of solidarity. In this case, solidarity, non-violent Polish non-violent revolution has vanished. We can try to figure out how it happened. I think one of the things was, yes, people were left alone. There are various things. One thing I think important is that those who are not believing in solidarity manage to persuade people that democracy is conspiracy and it's against them. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm done.
Yes, sure. One argument against solidarity was to say that solidarity was against liberty and against democracy. If you refer to historians have been very sensitive to the fact that if you take the example of E.P. Thompson in UK, were very sensitive to the fact that people were considering what they live precisely and not only what was in the statistics. And E.P. Thompson, when he wanted to comment social movement in England, he insists on the fact of a community of experiences, he says, and not only communities of interest, and not only community that could be derived from statistical knowledge, when perhaps our left-wing parties today, they inherited a much more rational vision of the world, a vision of given by a knowledge. The social sciences gave a knowledge of interest, gave a precise knowledge of the economic structure, of the structure of social classes, of social antagonism, but they don't give enough room to what the vision, the perception of the people. The perception of the people was not something considered as interesting because it was a false vision. The real vision was the objective vision of social sciences. And social sciences were not interested by the perception of the people. And I think that now it's one point match for the populist vision. That's for sure.
There is a question that was asked of the three of us last week, and we did not really answer it, although I did say that I agreed with the questioner, and I want to ask you the same question. And this is part of the response to Jean, because I think the response you gave had two components. One component on the level of politics, which is that the drive of democratization has been somehow stopped. And then another answer on a level of culture, namely the status problems, the meaning problems that emerge in the contemporary setting of political economies. But you're an economist, even originally by training, and you did not mention the economic, which is what the question last week was about. To what extent does the hegemony of the Washington consensus, to be more exact than neoliberalism, not a very exact term, to what extent did the hegemony of the Washington consensus in all countries, affecting even left-wing parties, play a role in opening the space to the populist challenge? Do you understand my question?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so it's as short as that. I don't want to go on give a diatribe on this. And I have doubts also.
The answer is an encyclopedia. Yes, it changed a lot, but it changed a lot because you had the pressure and the support also of countries like India, China, and Latin America. It's not only a Western invention.
No.
It's also a kind of trade-off with emerging economies. And it is the reason why it has been so strong. It has been very strong because of that. But today, the terms of the question have changed because with the necessity to find new ways of fighting for reducing the temperature and so on, CO2, it means also that we will be obliged to have a new vision of economics.
Yes.
A new vision of economics, and we are just at the beginning of how inventing a sober economy.
Yes.
How inventing a new type of growth. We are just at the beginning of that.
Yeah, you mentioned globalization, and of course, the work of Donny Roderick and Stiglitz, whose argument is that it's not that we should do away with globalization, which is to some extent some of the populists' logic, but rather to substitute smart globalization to avoid destructive races to the bottom. Basically, that's the smart globalization, avoiding races to the bottom. And I think that Piketty in your country is offering even more concrete proposals about how that could be done. And I think this is happening. The economics profession is changing.
Yes, sure. That's a very key point.
Well, thank you very much. It was wonderful. It's always wonderful to read you, which I read often. And it's even more wonderful to see you occasionally when I can.